Hey, wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and I am back for a second round. If you're tuning in right now, this is a follow-up to the emergency broadcast, the Bitcoin Hard Talk emergency broadcast that I just gave, where I gave my reaction to Donald Trump's speech. And I really suggest you go through that. I broke down all of the Bitcoin policies, the macro policies, and the geopolitics to cut through all the noise. Forget about the left, forget about the right. We're not Republican, we're not Democrats. In fact, I'm not even American. But I do want as many people to build and protect their wealth, no matter what happens in the presidential candidate in the US and what happens to them or what their policies are. And so I really suggest you go back to that and catch up on the Bitcoin Hard Talk emergency broadcast. This is going to be the second one. And this is designed in conjunction with the last one. But if you want to watch this one first, hey, you're here already, so let's get through it. But I suggest you go back to the Trump one after if you haven't watched it. We're going to be going through RFK Jr.'s presentation at the Bitcoin 2024 conference. I spoke at Bitcoin 2011, 2013, 2014, 2015, and many others. And I traveled across over 50 countries. This one was the most impactful from where we have come as an industry. And what I want to do is I want to break down the macro, the Bitcoin, and the geopolitical side of what RFK was saying. Now, will he get elected? I don't know. But what I do know, it won't happen. But what I do know is that these policies are exactly what whoever wins should be doing. Because we live in a two-party system in America, it's only going to be Trump or it's going to be Harris. And my belief is that it's going to be Trump if he doesn't get assassinated. But he has taken the money that he needs to take in order to less likely to be assassinated. Sorry for the conspiracy theories, but can't help but think someone was behind it. So we need to figure it out who it is eventually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a screen with the video from the presentation by RFK, and I'm going to speed it up. As you know, RFK has a bit of a voice condition. So hopefully speeding up will be okay. And I'm going to leave the commentary because I want you to understand what he has to say. Because what he says is some smart shit that you don't normally hear from many politicians. He gets a lot of stuff. We also know that he is controlled by lobby group interests, so I don't trust any politician out there. But I do want to analyze their words, and I do want to hold them account, and I do want you to hold them account, and I do want their policies to come through if they follow through with them when they are good, and I want to tell you the bad ones and what all the BS is as well. So without further ado, I'm going to now share my screen, and we're going to move over to the presentation with RFK that starts with, for those of you Hulk Hogan people, brought me back to my child here in the I Am a Real American. And Hulk Hogan was obviously at the RNC conference as well, introducing Trump. And I'm going to play it right now, and I'm just going to stop and give my commentary and reaction.
Hello, Bitcoiners. I am so glad to be back from my second Bitcoin conference. Since last year in Miami, I've been meeting with leaders and thinkers from this community. I've conferred with Bitcoin miners, with policymakers, with economists, with financial experts, with investors and developers and entrepreneurs to deepen my understanding of the extraordinary.
And I want to say right here, this is his second. So while most of the politicians are coming for the first time, RFK was the headline speaker last time. Prior to that, we had President Bukele announcing Bitcoin as legal tender, but RFK came back, and I do want to tell you, he is has a much, much better understanding than he did prior to this. So last year, he came and he was talking about putting governments on the blockchain. And for those that are new to Bitcoin, you kind of understand, you know, that intuitively makes sense, but he said some cringy things for those that have been around for a while. This time was very different because this time he met the Bitcoiners, he met the community, and he started transforming his own personal wealth using Bitcoin. he started putting together Bitcoin retirement funds for his children, and he became an official Bitcoiner. So do I believe him? After this speech, yes, I do. Now, whether he'll win or whether he'll get his policies through, but I believe that he is RFK Jr. is one of the Bitcoin community after this speech. And he met many, many people and many of my good friends in the industry to try and make sure that he's doing and understands it.
Promise of Bitcoin for our country and for our planet. After all I've learned, I intend, as President of the United States, to sign an executive order on day one, directing the Department of Justice and the U.S. Marshals to transfer the approximately 200,000 Bitcoin held by the U.S. government to the United States Treasury, where it will be held as a strategic asset.
Okay, so this is exactly what I advised. You heard it here on Bitcoin Hard Talk for the first time. I suggested that they should transfer the Department of Justice's Bitcoin over to Treasury, and we manifested that into existence over several months. It started to escalate on Twitter. Various other community members worked with the various politicians. There is now a bill live to make this happen. And if you watch the Donald Trump video, I explained a little bit of the background that the whole 200 may not be able to go across or transferred across because they do belong to other people. But watch the Trump video to understand a little bit more of that. Now, he starts strong. He makes the announcement and says that the 200,000 Bitcoins will be transferred over from the Department of Justice, who confiscated them from Silk Road, and then transfer them over to Treasury. Now, the most important thing is that you strategically hold those. So Michael Saylor gave a presentation after this. So RFK is speaking before Michael Saylor, if memory serves me well. And Michael Saylor strategically outlined exact strategies for individuals, for corporations, and for governments. Very interestingly, very similar to what I've been covering. I started writing a book several years back and broke it into those three sections. So it was interesting that Michael Saylor took that stance as well.
On day one as president, I will sign another executive order directing the U.S. Treasury to purchase 550 Bitcoin daily until the U.S. has built a reserve of at least 4 million Bitcoins.
So second announcement, very important. First part is transfer the Bitcoin over. The second part is to accumulate the position. Now, this is pretty interesting. 500 a day till we hit 4 million. That is a significant chunk of the 21 million Bitcoin. And so that in real time has significant impact on Bitcoin and its price as they accumulate this position, and really counters much of the Bitcoins that need to be sold by miners. It's a little bit concerning. I wouldn't want a government to own that much Bitcoin. However, that's the strategy, and that's the amount of Bitcoin it would take in order to build a long-term hodl position for America, dollar cost average every single day, just like El Salvador is. President Bukele buys 1 Bitcoin every day. RFK said, we're the United States, we want to do 500 approximately every single day until we got 4 million. And he obviously wanted the largest supply that would still make it, not too much of the entire 21 million. Personally, I think that's a lot. However, there is a lot of debt in the US that they need to counteract over a long-term hodl position if Bitcoin goes away that it has in previous cycles.
And a position of dominance that no other country will be able to usurp. Our nation holds approximately 19% of global gold reserves. This policy will give us about the same proportion of total Bitcoin. The cascade.
See, he understands gold. This is an important thing. Now, remember, there's always been an audit the Fed because we're not sure that they do own that. But allegedly, they own 19% of the gold reserves in Fort Knox. And remember, during a monetary renegotiation or after when a new world order is being set after an escalating world war. So if we went into World War III, which is looking increasingly more likely if NATO, the lobby groups, and the Fed get their way, then your gold to GDP ratio or your gold to debt ratio has historically determined whether you sit around at the table. And after World War II or after World War One, the Treaty of Versailles, Germany it had to assume all the debt of the winning allies and settle in gold, which created a hyperinflationary cycle before World War II.
Impact from these actions will eventually move Bitcoin to a valuation of hundreds of trillions of dollars. On day one as president, I will sign also an executive order directing the IRS to issue public guidelines that all transactions between Bitcoin and the US dollar are unreportable transactions.
Okay, so he's pushing the privacy angle. And by the way, this is a Bitcoiner's wet dream. This is all the things that we know are important. And if America was constitutional, these are all the things that America would think are important. However, we know that the America is occupied by the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is the force that makes America non-constitutional and has switched it from capitalism to communism and took away its hard money and took it down this debt path and debt cycle. So he said that if people want to own their own Bitcoin, they don't need to report those to the IRS. And remember, the IRS and income tax was only created when the Federal Reserve in 1913 said that we're going to take over the creation of the government's money supply after two failed attempts at creating a central bank. And then in order to pay the interest, everyone needs to pay tax. So they managed to obfuscate through a partnership between government and Federal Reserve and make people pay for it, create inflation, and steal more money at the same time as making all the people pay interest on the government debt in order to fund the wars that go back to the companies that profit from it.
And by extension, non-taxable.
And now he's saying that you would make it where it's treated like a currency. So rather than property, so the US made Bitcoin property because then they can tax it. So if you hold your Bitcoin and then you sell it for a profit, then you have to report that and there will be a capital gain. And then you'd have to sell some of the Bitcoin in order to pay the dollars to the it's not the Fed, the IRS. That makes it unusable as a currency. Whereas in El Salvador, you can use it as a currency because you can spend it without creating a tax liability on any of your gains. And this makes Bitcoin more useful, which means that you can save in your own money and spend it as you choose without having to do the capital gain tax. And then you don't even need to report it as well. Now, this will highly unlikely ever happen because the Federal Reserve and the lobby groups and the IRS will have their ways.
On day one as president, I will also sign an executive order directing the IRS to treat Bitcoin as an eligible asset for 1031 exchange into real property. Now, I want to say a couple of words about my observations about the Bitcoin community, which I consider myself part of. Despite their different viewpoints, I found the most striking feature of Bitcoin community is this kind of paradoxical juxtaposition marked by fierce divisions on several minor issues and an overwhelming sense of unity within the larger Bitcoin ecosystem. The Bitcoin community reminds me of how American politics ought to be, fiercely diverse, but ultimately united in our aspirations and our belief in our country and in our convictions that America is worth the fight. And in the
This is a really good point. In the Bitcoin community, we always fight people, the crypto community, Bitcoin versus crypto. We got all these scammers, you got all of these pump and dumpers. But at the end of the day, Bitcoin is hope. Bitcoin is freedom. Bitcoin is the ability to own your own money, spend your own money, and protect yourself from the oppression of the central banks that create debt-based Ponzi schemes. And that unifies many people around that hope. Now, many people want to steal your Bitcoin and scam your Bitcoin, so you got to learn how to secure them. But remember, in an environment where so much division and so many things can go wrong, many people in Bitcoin particularly are unified around that common vision. And we may agree around disagree around the different things. But I find that it is the type of, discourse you want in furthering this one vision. And the beauty is that it's mass and code. There is no CEO. There is no corporate bureaucracy. It is, people all working for free because they own some Bitcoin and they want to make Bitcoin better. I'm giving these videos because I want more people to experience the freedom of owning your own money spending your own money and fighting and having the financial freedom that it gave me in order to create intergenerational wealth as a result of giving people a wealth effect. And then you invest it more, and people are more civilized, and it brings out the best in people. I found that when people are free from debt slavery, that's when their best work is done. So I think it's an interesting point.
And we all come back together, united in our belief that Bitcoin is a technology for freedom, for optimism, for independence, for democracy and transparency. It is the currency of hope. It is the perfect currency. It is an elegant, poetic, beautiful, pure species that aligns perfectly with the highest ideals and aspirations represented by the American experiment with self-governance. It is incorruptible. It has integrity. It has self-sovereignty.
Well, I wouldn't say America is incorruptible. America is as corrupt as any country could be. It had a constitution in order to protect it from corruption of large government. And unfortunately, it got presidents assassinated because central banks were created. Two of them died, and then the third one stuck and created the largest debt-based Ponzi scheme that created all sorts of forever wars that were created by European bankers. And now the whole world and those that own assets beg the Federal Reserve and kiss the ring of the Federal Reserve, saying, please lower interest rates. Please push up my stocks and real estate. I don't believe in markets anymore because they want to push up the price, and that creates more wealth inequality, which is not very good for those that get on the wrong side of it. And it's taken a capitalist country with a good constitution into a socialist country with a Federal Reserve that would eventually be a communist country with a central bank digital currency, unless they implement RFK's policies and create a reverse trend to escape from the Federal Reserve. And then you need to do the second half of it. Remove the lobby groups that control Congress. We saw them all, the ones that were clapping like seals for Netanyahu when he is a war criminal and needs to be arrested. And they want to, he wants to show Biden that he's the boss of America because he has taken America's money that the Federal Reserve printed and put it back into bribing all the Congress members and making them clap like seals. And putting them in bribery networks through Mossad and the CIA, and making the politicians that are filthy perverts and making them sleep with children so they're on Epstein list. And the ones that don't want to sleep with children, they get photos of them so they can bribe them in order to get political bribes. That is the swamp. That is what's meant to be drained. And it is certainly not uncorruptible. You need mass and code like Bitcoin. Bitcoin has no CEO. Bitcoin has no boss. And Bitcoin is uncorruptible because it's mass and code, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And America could free itself from that, and so can every country. I'm in this for the humans, and the humans is a global movement to escape the fact that the Federal Reserve was originally created from the Bank of England and their funding, and then it was exported globally through the International Monetary Fund. And the International Monetary Fund hired economic hitmen in order to get the whole world into debt slavery while they print it, make the wealthy people richer in America. Those on the wrong side of it, they end up homeless, addicted to drugs, and then they use it to fight all sorts of wars and regime changes all around the world. 400 regime changes since America, over 400 since America went independent from the British monarchy. Okay, so yes, you may want it to be like that, but hey, governments are less needed in the future anyway. They all get disrupted by central bank digital currency. CBDs will probably choose Bitcoin to back them, and artificial intelligence will do a better job at running these different types of crazy corrupt systems in the end, most likely.
Promotes personal responsibility and accountability. It is decentralized and democratic. It is small on government and large on personal freedom. Bitcoin is anti-war. It is a fierce, merciless, and insurmountable foe of government corruption.
It is completely anti-war because the central banks are the ones that said, if you can obfuscate what happens with people's money, and you can give a special subsidy to the private banks to create digital currency every time they issue a loan, we can slowly take over everybody's freedoms and liberties. And that's exactly what they did. And so they can then use that in order to have these massive loans to military industrial complexes. And then you can expand organizations like NATO, get more and more in there, bribe the politicians, get the money back, and fund the war and push everything in that direction. So Bitcoin as a force against it. Remember, when you give people the ability to own their own money and spend their own money, most people don't want to spend it on war, because when you go to your people and ask them to invest in a bond for war, people only tend to do that during defense. But the military industrial complex doesn't want a defense budget. They want an attack budget, because they want all the money to come back into American defense companies, feed the war machine, kill more people, and then pretend that they're exporting democracy around the world. That's not what's happening. It is a war machine, as RFK figured out, and he lost his family members to that war machine because he tried to expose Israel for their illegal nuclear weapons, and he tried to expose the AIPAC and all the different Israeli lobbies that were buying, and tried to classify them as foreign agents. As soon as he implemented those things, intelligence agencies take over, controlled by the central banks, and America is no longer constitutional. And all of a sudden, you are the United States of Israel, as we are experiencing with all the politician deals. RFK is also one of those, unfortunately. So it will push that forward, but the freedom to that is rely on mass encoder Bitcoin.
Now, many of you know my own introduction to Bitcoin, my own conversion. I knew from my children about Bitcoin, but it was it seemed almost to me something like a fad or a novelty. And then I saw what happened in Ottawa. I was running at that time the Children's Health Defense, which was the premier advocate for medical freedom in our country, and we had embedded with the striking truckers in Canada a reporter for our newsletter, and she was traveling with the truckers from Alberta all the way to Ottawa. And the truckers are very diverse in Canada. They're Asian, they're black, they're white. The trucking strike, the truckers were doing something that all of us in our country take for granted. They were assembling to petition their government about something that they thought was important, which was the impacts, the financial impacts of the mandates on their businesses. If you look at the videos of that event, it was like Woodstock. People were giving out water bottles, they were picking up trash, they were playing music, they were being kind to each other. It was portrayed by the Canadian government as a right-wing, extremist, violent terror organization. And the government began using facial recognition.
That's the right way to describe that. So, the truckers were doing peaceful protests, and they were getting their bank accounts shut down. They were able to use Bitcoin in order to continue to transact. And this was a very famous, debanking, where you use Operation Choke Point 2.0, where you use finances as a weapon of mass destruction in order to inflict terrorism upon people. This happens all the time, and it has consequences where resistance movements do form. And we are seeing this at the highest level, at the individual level, and RFK gets it. And I think it's very good that he brought up and brought to people's attention these stories.
Recognition systems and other forms of surveillance to learn the identity of the truckers, looking at their license plates, etc. And then it froze their bank accounts. And it froze their $12 million PayPal account. And when Canada did that, it occurred that the premier template of democracy in the world besides the United States, it occurred to me immediately that transactional freedom was as important as freedom of expression in the First Amendment. And it froze their $12 million PayPal account. And when Canada did that, it occurred that the premier template of democracy.
Okay, yeah, this was a really important part of the Bitcoin story. For those of you that don't know, there was a massive financial blockade on WikiLeaks, which was one of the first companies to start using Bitcoin because it was doing perfectly legal things and exposing governments and holding them to account. Now, governments don't like being exposed and don't like being held to account. Now, obviously, there were agents that were leaking information. Now, whether they were following the law is their own thing. Chelsea Manning went to prison for that. But Julian Assange was a victim of this, and he continued to fund the website, and the WikiLeaks is a Bitcoin story. So much of what I know today is only revealed because it is not fed to me through traditional media. Traditional media is being controlled by lobby groups as well, the same lobby groups that control that power in order to make you feel a certain way and achieve a certain political agenda. And so RFK is talking very frankly about these different things and the freedoms that are taken away when you don't have freedom to transact. Talked about this for years, way back in some of the real early Bitcoin conference about freedom of speech is freedom to transact.
In the world besides the United States, it occurred to me immediately that transactional freedom was as important as freedom of expression in the First Amendment. Because if the government has the capacity, none of these truckers were charged with a crime, much less convicted. And yet the government was able to shut down their bank accounts. They couldn't pay their mortgages. They couldn't buy diesel for their trucks. They couldn't buy food for their children. One trucker told me that he was going to jail because he couldn't make mandatory alimony payments. And if a government is able to starve you, to evict you from your home, if you speak out against it, if you criticize government policies, then we are on the road to totalitarianism and slavery. And I began at that time looking seriously for alternatives, and it was that incident that led me immediately to grasp the potential of this technology to provide.
And everyone has a different way of getting into Bitcoin. And this is why I believe RFK, because he said, this is important to me. I came to the Bitcoin conference and then I started using it and I realized the freedom that it can give people. And Bitcoin is a freedom story. So, you know, I think it's really nice. I do believe what he's saying here. You know,
Transactional freedom and self-sovereignty. Last year at this conference, I proposed that as your president, I would fight to ensure the right to self-custody Bitcoin, to run nodes in our own homes, to stop the federal government from usurping First Amendment rights to open source, privacy-enhancing technologies. I pledge to prevent government officials from adopting CBDCs, which would inevitably morph into what we saw in Canada, a malevolent.
So it's great to see a lot of what I've been sharing with everybody over the years since 2011 is now coming into the highest stage from presidential candidates. This is really interesting and positive to see. So there is an anti-CBDC movement. Remember, a CBDC is not the digital currency, because right now all digital currencies are created by private banks anyway. But the CBDC would remove the creation of money away from the private bank over to the central bank. And the central bank could implement communism on a blockchain and control the entire government. That is different from a government digital currency or Bitcoin. And he talks about self-custody because Bitcoin exists outside of the financial system. It doesn't compete with central bank digital currencies. Stable coins compete with central bank digital currencies. Banks compete with central bank digital currencies. They are private bank digital currencies. They all have their own versions of the dollar and they all compete for fiat currencies, and they have different people that benefit from their creation. It used to be that governments would benefit from the creation of money, and that was all outsourced through law over time and created into debt-based Ponzi schemes. Now, this is pretty much my lifetime work, and it's just great to see that this is now being discussed at the highest level. Why? No one cared before. But as soon as Bitcoin come around, it created the largest financial education in history, where more and more people now understand the things that people used to boo me off stages and call me conspiracy theorist when I tried to tell them that banks create money. Now it's obvious and everyone gets it.
Tool for surveillance and control. Most importantly, I promise to secure the United States position as the global hub of cryptocurrency, innovation, and entrepreneurship, and investment, and technology. As a lifelong environmental, it is my hope that Bitcoin in this year's election. Nothing could make me more joyful than to see other political. After the time I spent with Bitcoiners last year, I left the Miami conference so enthralled with optimism and excitement about Bitcoin and its potential to eliminate the national debt as a hedge against inflation, its promise to guarantee personal freedom, to restore the American middle class, to end government corruption, to defund the war machine, and to protect our environment. And I haven't just...
Yeah, you used a lot of things there. These are all really, really key points. To defund the military-industrial complex, the war machine, that's what Bitcoin can do if the central banks don't stop it. So that's well, they can't stop it from individuals using it, but they can stop governments from using it, which is why he also talks about taking out the corruption. When you can put these ownership on a chain, we saw with the German government, you know, that Bulgaria was meant to have a couple of 100,000 Bitcoin. They disappeared. No one knows where they are because they didn't publish the address. El Salvador published their address, and we know they're adding 1 Bitcoin per day. Germany, we found out that they were selling their Bitcoin and then they announced it afterwards. So when governments have these public Bitcoin wallet addresses that they can secure, because Bitcoin allows you to publish your address, and then you can self-identify as owning it and prove it, then that adds massive layers of transparency around strategic reserves. Now, those reserve assets, which are significantly better than all these people lobbying, Ron Paul created his whole campaign around lobbying audit the Fed because he didn't believe that the gold was in Fort Knox anymore. We still don't know. And suddenly $2 trillion just disappears off a balance sheet. That can't happen with Bitcoin. We would know the movement and it would force governments to hold those savings. And we could see step by step how solvent a country is as their debt is being measured against their Bitcoin reserves. And we could see, and that would create a better credit rating government. Therefore, it would also act as ability to save. And we can have a reversal of many of the forces that are used in order to obfuscate money. The reason wars gets funded is because you have no idea what's happening with your money. You could deposit at a bank and that money could be used in order to fund something that you really don't care about or you don't want to, or you think is a human right violation or atrocity. And it does. That's how the machine works. It obfuscates it as a partnership between government to get bigger and central bank to take all the interest and create a debt-based Ponzi scheme that leads to complete control.
Just before that, at Miami convention, I got a big check from the fees from winning the Monsanto case. And I took most of that check, which represented the largest portion of my personal wealth, and I invested it all in Bitcoin.
So I believe him. Now, we could, if we wanted, if he needed to prove it, say, okay, I'll publish my wallet address. That could be every politician. They could do that. Those are the options that are available when Bitcoin becomes more interactive with politics. So if someone says they're a Bitcoiner, you could have a policy that says prove it. Now, personally, I think that freedom and liberties should come to individuals, but we need transparency with politicians. Those are all the types of opportunities. And he said, I took it and I invested it in Bitcoin. And once you invest in Bitcoin and you dollar cost average and you buy every month and you go through a 4-year cycle, you realize what would have happened to me if I saved in that toilet paper called fiat currency. Everybody will get it in the end. It's just a question of when.
I didn't do that with hopes for a quick return on investment. I was told you might have to wait a long time, and you might have to have a lot of anxiety and angina. So I was prepared for that. But if that had been my sole motive, by the way, I would not have been disappointed. Because I got in it with good timing. But over the past year, I've gone even further down the rabbit hole. Let me put it, the orange rabbit hole. I'm convinced now more than ever that we have to work together to put all these proposals into action immediately. America's at a crossroads. We can either continue down the path we are on, racking up debt, constricting freedom, addicted to war, or we can look forward to use new technologies like Bitcoin to help us evolve, to achieve again our promise as a moral authority and the world's exemplar for incorruptible democratic governance.
Yeah, the good thing about this is you can follow the two-tier strategy. So if it's too hard to drain the swamp, get in the Fed, and take them out of occupation, you can still have a side-by-side strategy. So you can have Bitcoin as a reserve asset on Treasury and government's balance sheet and allow the Fed to continue the debt-based Ponzi scheme. And that's what's most likely to happen from here. So Trump took RFK's policies, and he'll, if he becomes the next president, he made all these promises. And so we now have a bill in, Cynthia Lunis announced it, that there is a bill to make just this happen. And so while I feel I want to give props to RFK because he was the guy that came here, did this, did it the hard way, and everybody else is probably going to get the credit for the implementation. But the reality is this is an opportunity that's available to all. I've been given content for years and other people cover it later, but we're all in the same team with Bitcoin. That's the beautiful thing here. We're all in the same team because the game is to accumulate Bitcoin. There's only going to be 21 million of them. More of them get lost, and more governments now are going to want them as strategic asset and reserves. Now we've created this game theory and a race. So who's going to front run the government? It's up to us and anybody that wants to do that. And that's the beauty of hard money and scarcity. Um, and so you can have this two-tiered strategy, and the one that will win is the one that creates the most wealth. And so you can hedge yourself against a central bank, which creates a really interesting situation given all of the war expansion that is happening right now.
Now, I'm very happy to learn that I'm not the only one talking about Bitcoin in this year's election. Nothing could make me more joyful than to see other political leaders now jumping on the Bitcoin bandwagon. I've had over a year's head start to study, to understand, to articulate the potential of Bitcoin. And my goal as the first Bitcoin president will be to enact policies that will make America the world's greatest representative for Bitcoin and a proponent of its democratic values. I grew up assuming that America...
See, this is the really good point. This isn't, that's why Bitcoin is, we're all on the same team. None of us are CEOs of Bitcoin. None of us are, in the corporate world of how to climb the ladder of Bitcoin. Once you own Bitcoin, you've got the best minds in the world that are unemployable. Quite frankly, there's no one in the world that could give me a job. I won't take any job because Bitcoin gave me that freedom. But I dedicate my time to Bitcoin, and I dedicate my company to Bitcoin, and as many of our team members to Bitcoin, because we're all in the same boat of this one digital hard sound money that I believe was brought to us by God as to fight against the debt slavery that all of the religious scriptures taught us, that usury is the problem. This was forecasted thousands of years ago, and is the reason why. But we are in a usurious system because central banks injected it into the fabric of society, and Bitcoin gave everyone the ability to exit from that. What a truly remarkable time to be alive, and anyone can join it.
Would always maintain its status as the world leader, the leader of the free world. But ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1993, we've paradoxically been moving in a declining spiral away from that role. Hubris, military adventurism, and corruption have put America's political and economic power in precipitous decline. Our dollar...
Yeah, this is really interesting. So for those of you that know history in the Cold War, the Soviet Union was a genuine, fight for communism and capitalism. That was a genuine fight. And capitalism won that, and communism won certain regions. But all of the communist experiments, they all failed. Across Eastern Europe, all the communist states gradually moved over to capitalism. And we had this, the fall of the Berlin Wall that marked the end of the Cold War. And then the Soviet Union was replaced by Russia. And then we are now returning to a Cold War through NATO expansion. And so everything is being escalated where NATO is existing in different forces. So America expanded NATO across Ukraine. Russia retaliated, invaded Ukraine, and all the military industrial complexes benefit, civilians die. Then you have the exact same thing happening in Middle East. Israel illegally becomes a nuclear power, and then starts derailing after the Brits gave Israel its declaration, and then partners with the US in order to feed the war machine, where money goes from America, creates inflation in the US, feeds back to the companies and buys the politicians, so that then the politicians can create fake wars saying, oh, you got to fight communism, even though communism fell with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And you got to fight this fake war on terror, even though some of this money is going into bombing countries that creates groups of people that lost all their children, are trying to get revenge, and then end up being used by intelligence agencies like the CIA, Mossad and like MI5, in order to make you feel a certain way. And then they perpetuate out to the media that all people are like this. And you think that 2 billion Muslims are like these groups that are controlled by intelligence agencies that are creating terror. And then you create a war on terror, and you can persuade everyone to go into war. And so you then invade Iraq, and then you invade Afghanistan. And now you're being told, Netanyahu's telling you in Congress, that you need to wage war with Iran so that he can be in charge of NATO of the Middle East. He called it the Abraham Alliance. And now this is happening across Asia as well. You're being told that you need to expand your military industrial complex in Japan. Japan is de-investing in the US because they're trying to protect their currency, which was a partnership between the Bank of Japan and the Federal Reserve that occupied Japan after World War II. And then the Bank of Japan created the largest debt-based Ponzi scheme that pushed stocks and real estate up. It all came back. It's starting to hit, but their currency and the Japanese currency is having to be defended. So they're having to divest out of the USA. And you're being told that China is the enemy. China created the Great Wall of China to keep the barbarians out. They're not exactly an attack type of country. Now, they may want to reunify with Taiwan because a trade war was created that makes you think that and America and the Trump administration and the Biden administration tried to make it where Taiwan can't even sell its chips back to China, which is the future of the AI industry. It's an important part of the Bitcoin industry. It's an important part of protecting yourself and your defense. And so you drive people into these alliances through sanctions that distort it, but you end up with these military expansions. So NATO then says, let's have an Asian alliance, a Middle Eastern alliance. And so the Cold War has now returned. And we are experiencing at the end of a debt cycle, the sheer atrocities that central banks and lobby groups and the sheer foreign involvement in US politics. And I hope you're starting to see it. We cover it every week on Bitcoin Hard Talk. And make sure, if you haven't already, sign up to simondixon.com, get a free membership to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. I'll make sure you're on top of all these different trends. I'll make sure we got lots of different video series on how you can build and protect your wealth. And we can share this journey together, just as RFK did. And now he's serving his country to try and solve the debt crisis, to fight the oppression inflicted by the Federal Reserve by creating a counterattack with digital hard sound money. Beautiful.
Is rapidly losing its reserve currency status because we've weaponized it against other countries. When we disagree with the policies of another country, we kick them off the SWIFT system and we debank them. As a predictable result of that strategy, the BRICS nations are now in the process of de-dollarizing by getting off the petrodollar. They realize that trading their commodities and other hard resources.
Do you think RFK has been listening to Bitcoin Hard Talk over the years? Seems like a lot of stuff that I would normally say. But that's the beauty of this open source movement. We want the message to get out as wide as possible. And if it starts having impact at the highest level, that's what Bitcoin gave us.
Resources for money that is printed out of thin air is a losing proposition. This trend will likely accelerate until we make the tough transition toward backing our debt obligations with hard assets again. I have a plan to strengthen the U.S.
Honestly, you got to. He's got a voice condition, and I understand it's quite hard, and I'm watching it on space. But these are very profound subjects. These are very nuanced subjects that he's discussing. He gets the flow of money. His family were involved in many of these atrocities and gave their life for it. Now, I know that he is controlled by certain lobby groups because you can't become a politician unless you bow down to a certain lobby group. That's why he'll be very pro-Israeli, even though all the things that happened. But, you know, those guys, and by the way, when I say pro-Israeli, I mean pro-Israeli government. I'm talking about the governments here that are inflicting the atrocities upon the civilians and the people. But this is very profound stuff. He knows this subject. I'm pretty sure he's been watching over the years.
US dollar and lower the interest rates and neutralize our $34 trillion debt by backing US Treasury bills, notes, and bonds with hard assets, including a combination of precious metals and Bitcoin.
Yeah, the Federal Reserve will assassinate you. They'll get Mossad and CIA and MI5 in order to take you out. That's what your family tried to do, and that's why he got taken out.
Backing U.S. debt obligations by collateralizing them with hard assets not only restores strength to the dollar, it reins in inflation, and it will usher in a new era of American financial stability, prosperity, and peace. The world needs to believe that we have safely handled.
That's fact. Only an anti-American entity would not know that or would try and stop that, which is the Federal Reserve.
handcuffed our government and its ability to create money out of thin air with no proof of work. The innovative strategy that I'm proposing leverages the scarcity and liquidity of Bitcoin, along with gold and other hard assets, to restore the dollar's dominance in global finance. The world will rush to adopt an American-backed, decentralized currency that cannot be confiscated by governments, that can be traded and transacted on cell phones at the speed of light across every global border with no banking fees or other transactional friction. This incorruptible currency will immediately start pulling wealth and assets from every other nation around the globe back into the United States.
Fact. Any country can do this if you fight your central bank and you don't listen. Like President Bukele, he threw out the economic hitmen from the International Monetary Fund and said, I'm choosing Bitcoin. When the Bank of England said, we're concerned, he said, I'm choosing Bitcoin. Now there's dollars there as legal tender and there's Bitcoin there as legal tender, but the Federal Reserve is going to become more and more insignificant as he continues the Bitcoin strategy. Every country, every company, and every individual can do this. The rules are the same.
Restoring the strength of our dollar and repairing our balance of payments. 6 months before his assassination, my uncle President John F. Kennedy, signed an executive order that put silver coins in competition with the notes issued by the Fed.
Fact, he fought the Federal Reserve, he fought Israeli nuclear program, and he fought APEC to get the money out of the foreign. He wanted to classify it as a foreign entity so that they couldn't control politics. Look at where we are today. Netanyahu in Congress telling Biden, I control your Congress. Give me my bombs. I want to bomb Lebanon this week.
His intention was to rein in Fed discretion. He had been a critic of Fed policy, and he hoped to end the discretionary monetary policy and the inevitable debasement of the U.S. dollar. He understood that a highly leveraged economy leads directly to the destructive kind of wealth inequality that is today eroding American democracy.
Fact. The Federal Reserve creates wealth inequality by creating these debt-based Ponzi schemes that means the poorest people pay the highest interest rate and the richest people pay the lowest interest rate in an environment where you have to have more debt than money, and therefore you have to pay money that doesn't exist that benefits the banks that own the Federal Reserve and creates wealth inequality until you have a civil war. When you have a civil war, you have external parties that try to create a new world order. You then implement a new world order with sound money, and then you start again, and the new prosperity era continues until you come off hard money. Bitcoin gives us the opportunity to not make the same mistakes as gold and to hold everyone accountable. The best currencies in the future will be backed by Bitcoin. RFK gets it.
And generating violence and division and discontent and hopelessness. Notably, after my uncle's assassination, the government immediately stopped issuing those silver coins and power returned to the Fed. My uncle apparently understood that.
Who benefits from the assassination? Who benefits from the assassination of Trump? We have to ask those questions. This is all being rolled out in real time. Now, we're told that it's Iran, right? We're told that by the person that came to Congress and said, you need to go to war with Iran. And if Trump gets assassinated, who's next in line? J.D. Vance. He said he's a Bitcoiner, but he also said we need to do a very hard line with Iran. He also went over to meet Harris, and Harris said, yeah, we'll make sure that he's, he needs to end this war. But at the same time, we'll continue to fund him and do the status quo. We didn't arrest him, even though ICJ made him a war criminal. I'm talking about Netanyahu. And you're meant to arrest him, just like Putin, if you respect international law. But they're giving up international law in order to protect this. Who controls the purse strings? And when Biden tries to hold back the weapons, Biden suddenly is no longer running for president. Think about it. RFK knows it. But why does RFK have to just bow down to one force, even though he gets it? It's a blackmail ring. It's the Federal Reserve. It's a corrupt system that needs to be drained the swamp. And even Trump took 200 million from it as well.
The potential for the Fed to evolve itself into a tyranny. Bitcoin has the potential to return monetary discipline to the Fed and to restore the dollar as the unchallenged global reserve currency. And just as Bitcoin can fortify the dollar, it can also secure America's position in cyberspace. I understand that tomorrow President Trump may announce his plan to build a Bitcoin Fort Knox and authorize the U.S. government to buy 1 million Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset. And I applaud that announcement, and we should all applaud it.
See, this is the good thing, right? We're on the same team. So RFK, of course, you should announce it, but you're also very happy that someone else, if they're going to way more likely to win the election, you just want it to happen. And that's the Bitcoin spirit. That's the Bitcoin spirit.
I hope that President Trump's commitment to Bitcoin is more than political expediency. The most cynical political reason for endorsing Bitcoin is to excite the 60 million Bitcoin American holders by policies that make the number go up. But it's my hope that President Trump and the DNC nominee, who he or she may be, will develop a deeper understanding of the earth-shaking reasons to ensure that Bitcoin has a strategic reserve in the U.S. Treasury. The most compelling of those reasons is laid out in U.S. Space Force Major Jason Lowery's MIT thesis entitled Software. Major Lowery points out that Bitcoin has been mischaracterized as money, when in fact it is a cyber defense system that will protect our online identities and data in cyberspace. Just as we have an Air Force to protect our skies and a Navy to protect our seas, Bitcoin can protect us against potential cyber attacks.
Now, this is really interesting because the attack of the future is cyber. And so to start to explore down this new research field of Bitcoin as protection from cyber attacks is really interesting when you're planning your national security, because at the conference, there was a lot of talk around how Bitcoin can be repurposed in order to create renewable energy innovation, repurpose wasted electricity, and give a strategic national security interest by supporting the growth of the electricity industry. Combining that with AI as well, now we've got the whole national security. Now, the Federal Reserve doesn't like that. The bank lobby doesn't like that. The military-industrial lobby doesn't like that. And so these will be the forces that try and make sure that these things don't happen. Or if you can't beat them, join them. But no one wants to give up that control. That's why this is going to be a big fight and probably a side-by-side strategy. But now the world knows that it makes total sense. And that was the battle. Making the world know that this makes total sense. So the more individuals that do this, the more companies that do this, the more countries that do this, we have created an unstoppable force. And the worst that can happen is the central banks get their way and we can exit. Beautiful, beautiful. Satoshi Nakamoto changed the world and everyone that's a part of it. Everyone that contributed to this and everyone that contributes into the future.
It is a cyber defense weapon and a classic example of unrecognized use. Here's an analogous example. The Chinese invented gunpowder, and then they used it as medicine for 200 years before other countries recognized that it was the most potent tool for power projection. Today, the popularly assumed use of Bitcoin is money, but Bitcoin is also a power projection weapon that can protect our currency and everything that we do online from cyber attacks. The first country that recognizes this function will be the new global superpower.
How's that for an anti-NATO force? So while NATO is committing all these atrocities, assassinating, massacring people, committing genocide, we're seeing it all, children dying, all funded by your inflation. And at the same time, we can have this anti-resistance movement against the central bank and a peaceful defense. Let's move back from an attack budget to a defense budget. Bitcoin is hope.
We need to grab the reins and harness Bitcoin's full potential if we want to regain and consolidate our title as leader of the free world. Based on public information, the USA currently owns 204,000 Bitcoins, the fifth largest Bitcoin.
If you didn't watch my Trump video, I shared the story on this. I'm not going to share it again. Make sure you watch this video that I did with the Trump, and you can share on the 205,000 strategic reserve Bitcoin. There's a massive story. We were involved in it in 2016 as well. So make sure you check that out.
Bitcoin all over the world. Adding Bitcoin to that reserve will help secure the future of the United States for the next 250 years. One of my first hires in the Kennedy administration would be Major Lowry as my top advisor. As my top advisor for my national security team. Another important use of Bitcoin for America and the world is the one that is dearest to my heart, capturing carbon and incentivizing green energy production through Bitcoin mining. I served for 40 years as an environmental champion and for a decade as a partner in the green tech venture capital firm Vantage Point, which is the #1 green tech energy and technology firm in the world. I played key roles in developing some of the world's largest solar and wind power generation projects. Critics of Bitcoin have wrongly cast it as an environmental threat because of its high energy demand. The opposite, of course, is true. Bitcoin miners are more sensitive to energy pricing than any other industry. This means that they can only survive in the marketplace by utilizing the cheapest energy, and that invariably means waste energy and surplus power. For example, methane from landfills would otherwise go into the atmosphere, but Bitcoin miners are uniquely able to harness it as an energy source. Bitcoin mining is also the ideal partner for renewable energy and variable power projects like wind and solar.
Fact, fact, fact. Avoid all of the shit that those people in the ESG world saying, let's go to proof of stake, Ethereum's all efficient. Proof of work is multi-purpose, and it is a resistance movement against central banking, and it is a lot cheaper than the humanitarian crimes that central banking does with our money by obfuscating it.
My personal experience in energy project finance left me with a deep appreciation for the critical potential for Bitcoin mining as a reliable profit center for renewable energy projects that need flexible, on-site, off-peak customers for intermittent energy generation in order to get financing. Bitcoin miners are the ideal partners for these kind of projects. All right, let's lean into some of the other ways that Bitcoin is good for Americans and for America. President Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971 to finance the Vietnam War. Since then, the dollar's purchasing power.
Fact, fact, fact. RFK gets it. Let's repeat that. President Nixon took us off the gold standard in order to fund the Vietnam War. I've been to Vietnam. I've been to the Vietnam War Museum, and I've met people on the street that are still deformed from the chemical warfare that happened as a result of this war, that was funded by saying, rather than figure out diplomacy, let's take it off the gold standard. Let's create all this inflation, the world's largest debt-based regulated Ponzi scheme, and let's pretend that we're doing it for people. This is the forces at work. And we think that the Federal Reserve is just this institution that's there to stabilize markets for us. And we bow down to the Federal Reserve in order to push our stocks up and distort the markets. Bitcoin fixes that issue. And even if it doesn't, it gives people the ability to vote with their money. This is saving lives. This is preventing wars. How do you think all this money that's creating all these wars is created right now? Through your inflation. We're all complicit in this system by using fiat currencies.
Has been in precipitous decline, eroding savings and earnings of everyday Americans. Alan Greenspan, who was the chair of the Fed for 20 years, even warned that, quote, in the absence of a gold standard, there is no way to prevent savings from confiscation through inflation, end quote. Inflation, as we all know, is theft. And it's almost always theft from the poor.
And who stole it? The laws that were changes, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the same year they implemented income tax. It's a massive, slow scam. It's a Ponzi scheme. And we're all still people are still saving in fiat currencies. It's theft. It's obfuscation by complexity. I'm going to be releasing a 4-part video series. I've been working on it to help people really understand these trends in plain, simple English. If you're not a member of the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal on simondixon.com, please make sure you got a membership right away. And I'm going to make sure that you get that free video series And I'll even share about in 2020, I invested $1 million live just to show people, because people were saying, Simon, you're lucky you were involved in Bitcoin when it was $3. Yeah, I was. But I showed people what I do if I start again in 2020, published it all live to Bitcoin Hard Talk members. I'm going to do the same in 2024. 10x, that whole strategy. Everyone can do that. Everyone thinks they're too late, they've missed the boat, and they start looking for shit coins. Make sure you got a membership. I'm going to be releasing that video series in September, October. We're having the videos created right now. I want to make sure people understand that.
Four, the Fed has engineered an uber-efficient money printing machine to perpetrate the systematic robbery that has gutted the American middle class and decimated America's working poor. The obscene money printing has drained our citizens of their purchasing power through the hidden tax of inflation. And it was the Trump and Biden administration's reckless embrace of money printing that have pushed the middle class over the tipping point now.
Fact. Both of them printed $7 trillion each. Yeah, so don't believe the whole, this was just Biden. This was Biden and Trump, because it's systemic. It's systemic. All you can do is create the anti-force against it and give everyone slow time to transition over to Bitcoin.
American households are now buckling under the strain. Let's look at it simply. If you had $1,000 6 years ago, that $1,000 has a value of $520 today in terms of its capacity to purchase goods and services. Mortgages have doubled in 4 years. No wonder half of the 18 to 30-year-olds are still living at home, unable to afford the homes that provide the first step toward the American dream. No wonder our younger Americans are marrying later, delaying or even abandoning the choice to start a family. Their dwindling purchasing power forces them into these sacrifices. The hopelessness of the task of steadily growing savings, which we all assumed that was just part of our lives, it has pushed. And now today, this generation is facing these moving goalposts. They make money, they think they're doing well, and then the money disappears. And not for anything they did, but because inflation. And it has pushed this whole generation into a kind of financial nihilism. And it's contributed to the epidemics of depression, of suicide, of hopelessness, of alienation, of dispossession, of the loss of pride in our country, the loss of hope for their own generation and their own futures among young Americans.
It's a fact. Even people are not having children right now because they can't afford to have children. This is a level of degeneracy that these flows of money are taking us through. That all of those forces, the world makes sense once you understand it. All you got to do is follow the money. And RFK has followed the money, and he's presenting to you right in front of it, as I have been for over 2 decades now. I think I've been given content. Now you're seeing it firsthand.
Healthcare costs are also increasing exponentially. I talked a couple of months ago with a young New Hampshire couple, and they told me with tears in their eyes how they had gotten in an argument, the husband and wife, holding a crying baby in their arms at night and having to wonder about whether that baby was $50 sick or $100 sick or $500 sick before they brought him to the emergency room. Over half of Americans cannot put their hands on $1,000 if they have an emergency. If you are part of that cohort and the engine light goes on in your car, it is the apocalypse, because you know you're not going to be able to afford the mechanic. You won't be able to get to work. You won't be able to pay your rent, and then you're going to be out on the sidewalk. And that death pile has ended up with this army, tent encampments in the cities that I live in Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, and all over the country, where armies of Americans, of hardworking Americans, are now living because the engine light came on in their car, or they got 2 flat tires at once, or they had some other expense that was unanticipated. Walk outside and you're going to see it. Time and again, I'm hearing from elderly Americans about how they cut their prescription pills in two to make them last at the end of the week. They're choosing between gasoline and home heating oil and food. So many mothers have told me that they're downgrading ingredients to get out the grocery store checkout line. Americans today are being forced to make these gut-wrenching decisions because our money is broken.
This is global, right? You think 10% inflation's bad. Try going to Zimbabwe. Try going to Lebanon. Try being in Egypt, in Sri Lanka. Try being in Pakistan. Look what it has done to those in the countries that got to almost 10% inflation. How about 900% in Zimbabwe? That's destruction. And that is because the Fed is exporting it through the IMF and the World Bank to these countries as well, and then bringing out the worst in human behavior and corruption in order to try and stay ahead. It's taken us down a level of degeneracy. Hard money is the solution.
With a beleaguered American middle class, Bitcoin is the off-ramp from the inflation highway of doom. If the world were on a Bitcoin standard and our money held its value, we would all have the ability to live more abundant lives. Bitcoiners have it right. Fix the money, fix the world. The discipline of tying our dollars to hard assets like Bitcoin will also finally break our addiction to forever wars. Fiat currency was invented to fund war. As I pointed out just now, President Nixon got us off the gold standard in 1971 because printing fiat currency was the only way to continually finance the Vietnam War. Prior to fiat currency, when a country ran out of money, the war would end. Or if a government wanted to fund a war, it would issue war bonds and borrow the money from its citizens, or it would tell them in advance, we're going to tax you. Today, governments don't need to even ask that permission. They just print the money.
I swear I'm listening to an episode of Bitcoin Hard Talk here, like RFK dropping so many truth bombs. It's great to see.
And then they fund the war with fake money. If the world was on a Bitcoin standard, then there would be no war because the governments can't print Bitcoin. I'm a proponent of Bitcoin because it can defund the military-industrial complex that is bent not on national defense, but on international global domination. And I'll say this, during the height of the Cold War, the military budget was about $500 billion in 2024 dollars. Today, it's double that. Why do we need twice the money that we needed during the height of the Cold War? Well, we need it because it has nothing to do with national defense. It has to do with global hegemony and international domination that is actually counterproductive. It's bankrupting us at home. And it has destroyed our relationships and our moral authority across the globe. So let me say it again. If governments couldn't print money with a couple of keystrokes on a computer, they wouldn't be able to fund wars that never end. Again, fix the money, fix the world. And make no mistake, one of the main reasons my administration will fix our broken money is to defund the war machine. To reach that goal, I'm going to support making direct ownership of Bitcoin tax-free. The conversion of Bitcoin back into dollars will be non-reportable transaction to the IRS and not subject to capital gains. We have to remember that the Fourth Amendment guarantees the right to privacy. As a constitutionalist, I'm an adamant defender of our right to financial and transactional privacy. When U.S. citizens are required to report every Bitcoin transaction to the IRS, the government knows everything that we are doing with our money. Governments have no business knowing your business. More importantly, making the direct ownership of Bitcoin tax-free creates financial incentive to own Bitcoin and not a Bitcoin ETF, which is a security and therefore subject to capital gains. This is crucial because direct ownership of Bitcoin keeps it decentralized. And
right. This is like really the intelligence of RFK here. This is smart policy, right? He understands that if you classify Bitcoin as a currency, it's not subject to capital gains tax. And if it's not subject to capital gains tax, you'd be incentivized to own Bitcoin rather than a Bitcoin ETF because Bitcoin ETF is a security. And if it's a security, it's subject to capital gains tax. This is smart stuff. This is someone that's done his homework. This is someone that has the right team. This is somebody that knows how to end the occupation of the Federal Reserve and slowly have a counter movement against the swamp.
And that's
probably because his family was taken out by the CIA and the intelligence agencies and Mossad for their policies to drain the swamp, which is why at the end of the day, unfortunately, the Bitcoin strategy is the only one that works, because anyone that tries to do what he is trying to do here disappears, just like they tried to take out Trump. And Trump now has to come down to the other side and say, spread all sorts of lies so that everybody goes to war with Iran.
It's the only way to prevent BlackRock and other global asset managers from having undue influence over the Bitcoin network, over its forks, and over its upgrades. In 2014, the IRS declared Bitcoin to be property.
See, proper nuance here. He gets it, right? So, having, again, it's not a proof of stake network, but this type of intelligence thinking is really important.
And regulated the purchase and sale as a capital transaction. It's important to understand that this tax law was never passed by Congress, and it was never signed into law by the President of the United States. The IRS and the SEC simply usurped government power in order to suppress decentralized financial democracy. The U.S. Supreme Court recently, of the Chevron doctrine, reopens that decision. And that decision has allowed freedom-fighting Bitcoiners to challenge the constitutionality of taxing Bitcoin for the 2024 year. I'm telling you today that I will never, ever sign a law that taxes direct ownership of Bitcoin. I will use my power to reverse any law that does so. I will end the Biden administration's war on Bitcoin. Tax-free Bitcoin is not only critical for citizens' financial autonomy, freedom, and privacy, it is essential to keep it decentralized and democratic as Satoshi created it to be. Finally, Bitcoin guarantees property rights. With freely transactable Bitcoin, no government will be able to confiscate or tax your wealth at the border. This is another example of Bitcoin's potency as a weapon against totalitarianism. So as this election cycle starts to heat up, you have choices to make. You've heard what I propose to do. Let's compare that to what my Republican opponent proposes. And I welcome President Trump's new enthusiasm for Bitcoin, but he's only weeks into the Bitcoin dialogue. And I have the advantage of being here longer. And hopefully his learning curve will mirror the kind that I went through. My guess is that initially, at least, there's going to be a lot of talk about pricing and how a change in government policies can make Bitcoiners wealthy. But we all know that that is just one of the minor points of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is about something much bigger. Bitcoin is about our souls. It's about our values. The price go up feature is the least of all of its attributes. President Trump has a long way to go to explain how his personal values align with those of Bitcoiners. If he doesn't do that, then we don't really have any assurance, do we, that his endorsement is not another ephemeral monetary policy fad du jour. That assurance will require him to repudiate some of the central policies of his last administration. During his years in the White House, President Trump has consistently spoke out against Bitcoin. In December of 2020, he was openly hostile to Bitcoin and tried to outlaw self-custody wallets. This was a time when Americans, particularly more than any time in our history, needed any store of value that they could get to compensate for the hits to their income from the lockdowns, from the declining purchasing power due to the money printing orgy and the COVID closures of all of our businesses. In 2021, President Trump doubled down and declared that Bitcoin, it just seems like a scam. I don't like it because it's another currency competing against the dollar. I'm happy that President Trump has had this evolution. I'm proud that I helped blaze a trail that made it easier for other political leaders to follow. And I'm grateful to the 50 or 60 million Bitcoiners like Michael Saylor who were there before me and helped me understand the nation-saving potential of Bitcoin. Every Bitcoiner I know shares my own yearning for freedom, for my skepticism toward official orthodoxies and pronouncements, and an inclination for critical thinking that I most admire. During COVID, neither President Trump nor President Biden protected our constitutional rights. They both restricted our right to assemble, to worship. They closed our churches, no funeral for grandma, no weddings. They closed our businesses without due process or just compensation in violation of the Fifth Amendment. They ended the Seventh Amendment right to jury trials. They assaulted the Fourth Amendment prohibition against warrantless searches and seizures, and also both these administrations allowed the FBI and the spy agencies to suppress our rights to free speech by working with social media companies to deplatform people who criticize government policies. I hope that President Trump's change of heart in Bitcoin is evidence of a newfound and deep-seated commitment to personal freedoms, to our Constitution, to our Bill of Rights. Will President Trump fight for Bitcoin if he's elected? I wish he had mentioned Bitcoin in the RNC speech last week. I'm disappointed. He spent a lot of the last week attacking President Bukele of El Salvador, the only country on a Bitcoin standard. President Bukele is the most popular president in El Salvador's history, and with Bitcoin's help, he has turned the country around. Bitcoin helped him grow the economy and reduce crime. The U.S. should want to take a page from President Buckley's playbook and learn some of the lessons that he has to teach us about Bitcoin.
He's hitting on all the points. He's definitely orange pilled. It's either written incredibly well, but I think you can tell the difference when someone gets it, it's in his soul. The only criticism I have here is I know that he's funded by the same lobby groups that Trump is funded by and Harris is funded by and all the VPs are funded by and every single member of Congress is funded by in order to make it United States of Israel.
And even more alarming, President Trump, in an interview last month with Bloomberg, floated the idea of bringing on Jamie Dimon as his Secretary of Treasury. I'm grateful that President Trump yesterday walked back that comment, but I'm not sure how he could have ever considered bringing on one of the biggest long-time critics of Bitcoin and the world's ultimate advocate for centralized control, if he truly is committed in his soul to the freedom and decentralization that we all.
Literally, the Morgan family, Jamie Dimon's the CEO of JP Morgan. The Morgan family were around designing the Federal Reserve System in order to control governments and to, sat around in Jekyll Island. And Trump said he's going to make Jamie Dimon the person that is the banker of Jeffrey Epstein. There's been involved in so many scandals and paying so many billions of dollars of fines to commit crimes. And that's who he won in charge, and also been the biggest critic of Bitcoin. And suddenly we're meant to believe, Jamie Dimon's a pro-Bitcoiner. At least RFK's pointing that out.
We all are committed to. Those choices don't match the spiritual alignment of Bitcoin. Bitcoin represents. Personally, I would rather see somebody like Michael Saylor or Caitlin Long as Treasury Secretary. They are brilliant. They are encyclopedic. They're forward-thinking. They deeply love our country. And they represent the ideals of decentralization and economic democracy. Finally, President Trump has had 4 years to pardon Ross Ulbricht and Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. And he didn't do it. And we need to ask ourselves why. I've already looked into those cases, and I plan on pardoning them all on day one.
Very important. Edward Snowden, a Bitcoiner. Julian Assange, a Bitcoiner. And Ross Ulbricht, a Bitcoiner. All victims of the swamp. All victims for standing up against and exposing the war criminals. Creating and using Bitcoin as a method to expose the atrocities that governments are committing, and created WikiLeaks in order to be able to expose more and more and more, so that Americans can wake up and realize that their freedom comes at the cost of other people's terror. And the very same people that are trying to change the system are the ones that now the system needs to bow down to. This is a truly remarkable moment in Bitcoin's history. Do I rely on RFK to get this done? No, I don't, because Bitcoin's going to work anyway. Bitcoin's going to happen anyway because it's mass and code. But it's truly remarkable that now we've hit a point in our history where everything we knew was going to happen, everything we imagined was going to happen, is now happening. Companies need to come to us. Governments need to come to us. We're draining. This is the real draining the swamp. And we're going to hold all of these politicians accountable, because unfortunately RFK is not going to get in. And if he does, he'd probably go in the same direction as his family for exposing the atrocities. But that's why he's got to accept the same money that Trump has to accept in order to get in. And then we get to at least see the Bitcoin reserve asset. And if they don't do it, there will be wide-scale change. And I hope to see you at the other end of World War III, because that's where the central bank wants to print the money and make more and more wealth inequality and spread some of the forces that RFK is sharing right in front of our very eyes. Right, we're almost at the end here, so we're gonna wrap up soon. But I want to make sure everyone watches this.
Oh, oh, and in this election year, I encourage you to study your choices, look at the candidate's policy, but more importantly, look at their actions to decide if they are genuinely part of the problem or if they're part of the solution. Decide if they align with what you believe in your heart. Remember, Americans need, and remember what Americans need and what we want, and then vote accordingly. I want to leave you today with a core belief in Bitcoin, in the Bitcoin community. Bitcoin is the currency of freedom, the currency of liberty, the currency of hope. It restores self-sovereignty back to the individual, which is the whole purpose of American democracy. It gives us digital property rights, which is the core of our democracy. And it provides a store of value that will allow middle-class Americans to live in abundance again. I want to be the president who can bring back hope. And I'm grateful to be part of your Bitcoin community. In fact, I don't think of myself as red. I don't think of myself as blue, and I don't even think of myself as purple. Those are the colors of the political parties. Instead, I think of myself as orange. That is the color of freedom. And it's true, President Trump has orange hair. And I can only admire him for that from afar. I'll never be able to match him on that. It's a really great start, but I have an orange heart, and that's what you should support. Thank you all very much, and God bless you.
Okay, so there it is. And I want to leave you with a few final messages. As I said, if you're long-term subscribers of Bitcoin Hard Talk, none of these messages will be new to you. But isn't it remarkable to see that this tiny little experiment that I first encountered at the first Bitcoin conference, where we tried to get 100 people in a room to create a mission of us versus the banks, after me having to leave my career in investment banking to try and tell the world about monetary reform and the atrocities that central banking creates, giving up on the UK government because the UK government wouldn't listen, because the entrenched interests of the banking lobbies and the Bank of England were deeply entrenched into the system. And trying to create a non-fractional reserve bank so people could own their own money, spend their own money, and not have to create digital currency that benefits the bank every time they issue a loan that creates debt slavery, that the Bank of England just point blank refused when we tried to create it, a bank to the future. And then we found Bitcoin, and we pivoted over to supporting the Bitcoin companies that now became the largest multi-billion-dollar companies, whether it's a Coinbase, a Kraken, a Bitfinex, a Bitstamp. They were all a part of our investors investing in these companies to build the future of finance in a collaborative way where we all did it together. And now the governments are coming to us. President Bukele led the way. I tried to get Boris Johnson to do it in 2013. He laughed me out of the room. I tried to do it in the Isle of Man in 2014. And the Bank of England contacted the Isle of Man and said, you're not allowed to make Bitcoin legal tender. We'll defund your entire banking system. We went over to Iceland and we created the first Bitcoin bond. That created a retirement for Bank to the Future customers that paid Bitcoin dividends. Thousands of Bitcoins paid as dividends to our investors. They used that money to reinvest in some of the companies that created the largest companies in the world. As soon as we realized that Bukele was going to do it, announced on that stage in, I think, 2021, if my memory serves me right, he said he's making Bitcoin legal tender. He stood up to the IMF. He stood up to the Bank of England. And everyone ridiculed him, saying this Bitcoin strategy ain't going to work. I immediately got a jet over to El Salvador, started meeting people on the ground the gangsters that used to take 30% of their money, no longer taking their money. They're saving that in Bitcoin. Lightning Network is developing to make it possible to make these micro payments. We then get a growth in this mining industry where it starts saying, you think we're energy inefficient? We're going to create some of the best energy efficiency and the best use of Bitcoin mining in the world. The industry got together, they got to work, they created it, and we had ended up with this amazing innovation that happened by using proof of work. The security gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Every cycle, we take out every reason why people said that we would fail. They said we would fail because we were a currency just for drug dealers. They said that we would fail because we were just for gamblers. They said that we would fail because Bitcoin's a Ponzi scheme and a scam. Fiat currency is a Ponzi scheme. Bitcoin has exposed it for what it is. And we created this, we've done this, and we're all going to do it together. And you are still early, even if you are joining us right at the beginning. Bitcoin is hope. Bitcoin is peace. Own more Bitcoin every month. Take your fiat currency, spend less than you earn, save the rest in Bitcoin, and join this movement, because everyone's going to join us in the end. But what are you going to do in order to get here and join us? Always remember, you're alive at one of the most exciting and interesting times in financial history. So many are going to get wrecked. Many are going to die in wars. Others are going to do incredibly well. I want you to be on the right side of this change, and I will always be committed to the truth. Anything you think I got wrong, use the comments below. Let me know where you think I'm wrong. I'm here to learn. I'm here to spread the truth. But I've been on the right side of history several times, and I think with this one, I'm on the right side of history again. But let's do this with peace. Peace.